My name is Anderson Cooper. And before we talk about Greenland, before we talk about Europe erupting in outrage, I want you to picture something that barely made a headline. A quiet, legal memo circulated in Washington. No press conference. No flag behind a podium. Just a few paragraphs redefining how the United States interprets strategic territory in the Arctic. While cameras were focused elsewhere, that document signaled a rupture. And by the time Europe reacted, the decision had already been made. This is how power really moves. Not with noise, but with paperwork. What you were told is simple. Donald Trump made a shocking move on Greenland. Provocative rhetoric. Diplomatic theater. Another headline designed to inflame emotions. But that explanation is comfortable, and comfort is dangerous. Because this was never about a soundbite or an impulsive statement. This was about something much deeper, much older, and far more unsettling. Greenland is not just ice and rock. It is leverage. It is a hinge between continents, the quiet cornerstone of a global order built on stability, predictability, and rules. And what we are witnessing is not a territorial dispute in the traditional sense. This is a philosophical collision between institutional restraint and market-driven opportunism, between a world governed by slow consensus and one ruled by speed, extraction, and volatility. Ask yourself this. Why now? Why Greenland, of all places at this moment in history? Because the Arctic is no longer frozen geopolitically. Melting ice has exposed shipping routes, rare earth minerals, and military positioning that were unreachable just a generation ago. And while Europe continued to treat Greenland as a peripheral responsibility, a dependency safely parked in the margins of global affairs, Washington began to see something else entirely. A pressure point, a shortcut, a way to bypass alliances and speak the language of raw power. This is where the story turns uncomfortable, because the outrage you see in European capitals is not just moral indignation. It is fear. Fear of being exposed as reactive rather than strategic. Fear of realizing that decades of assumptions about permanence and sovereignty may no longer protect them. And here's a question that should keep you watching. If a territory protected by treaties, history, and international norms can suddenly be reframed as a negotiable asset, what else could be redefined tomorrow? Your energy prices? Your pension funds? Your job security? This is not about Greenland alone. This is about whether the rules you were promised still apply when the stakes become too high. To understand how we arrived here, you have to rewind decades to a time when Greenland was treated less as a strategic actor and more as a geopolitical afterthought. After World War II, the island slipped into a kind of diplomatic invisibility. Officially tied to Denmark, shielded by NATO membership, and geographically remote, it became the perfect example of something powerful nations agree not to think about too deeply. Stability was assumed. Permanence was taken for granted. And when something is assumed to be stable forever, it quietly stops being defended. For years, Europe viewed Greenland through an administrative lens, not a strategic one. Budgets were allocated. Autonomy arrangements were negotiated. Cultural identity was discussed. But the deeper structural question was left untouched. What happens when the Arctic stops being frozen? What happens when global trade routes redraw themselves? What happens when the ground beneath those treaties becomes economically valuable? Those questions were postponed, not answered. Meanwhile, the United States never left Greenland. Not really. Thule Air Base remained operational, quietly embedded into America's missile defense and early warning systems. Legally, the framework already existed. Defense agreements dating back to the Cold War allowed Washington to operate with remarkable latitude. What changed was not the law. What changed was the interpretation of opportunity. This is where mechanics matter. Trump's move did not emerge from nowhere. It rested on a reinterpretation of strategic necessity under U.S. national security doctrine. In simple terms, if a territory is essential to defense, energy security, or supply chains, it becomes fair game for extraordinary measures. Not invasion, not annexation, but economic pressure, diplomatic leverage, and financial incentives that blur the line between cooperation and coercion. Europe underestimated this shift because it was still playing an institutional game. Committees, consensus, long timelines. Washington, under Trump, was playing a market game. Speed, scarcity, first mover advantage. Who gets there first? Who locks in access? Who controls the choke points? And here's the uncomfortable truth. International law does not disappear in this environment. It becomes negotiable, flexible, interpreted by those with the power to test its limits. So when European leaders say they were shocked, what they are really admitting is that they were unprepared. Unprepared for a world where stability is no longer the default setting, but a commodity that must be actively defended. Ask yourself this. How many other regions are being assumed safe right now? How many dependencies are being managed instead of protected? And who is already calculating their value, while institutions debate their meaning? This crisis did not start with Trump. He simply exposed it. Now, let's talk about how this actually works. Because power does not move through speeches, it moves through mechanisms. Behind the shock headlines was a choreography of legal, financial, and infrastructural pressure that most citizens never see. And that invisibility is precisely what makes it effective. At the center of this shift is access. Access to land, to minerals, to ports, to data, to military positioning. Greenland sits on vast reserves of rare earth elements, the same materials that power smartphones, electric vehicles, and advanced weapon systems. For years, these resources were considered impractical to exploit. Too cold, too remote, too expensive. Climate change quietly erased those objections. The technical lever here is investment, not occupation. American-aligned funds began signaling interest in infrastructure projects, airports, mining operations, and energy grids. These are not neutral decisions. Infrastructure defines dependency. When a port is financed by one power, trade flows toward that power. When energy grids rely on external expertise, sovereignty becomes conditional. Legally, this operates through bilateral agreements, development loans, and security exemptions. None of it violates international law on its face. That is the brilliance and the danger. Every step is defensible in isolation. Together, they create a gravitational pull that shifts control without ever raising a flag. Europe's institutions are poorly designed to counter this. The European Union regulates markets. It does not move fast enough to compete in them. Denmark, bound by both EU norms and domestic politics, found itself structurally constrained. Greenland's local government, promised autonomy but dependent on external capital, was placed in an impossible position. Who do you listen to when survival and sovereignty pull in opposite directions? This is where winners and losers begin to emerge. In the short term, corporations win. Mining interests gain early access. Defense contractors secure long-term positioning. Financial actors profit from volatility, but stability loses. Institutions lose. And the long-term public interest is quietly sidelined. And here's the question that should unsettle you. If strategic assets can be influenced without democratic consent, without public debate, without even a vote, what does sovereignty really mean in the 21st century? The counterpoint, of course, is resistance, European backlash, diplomatic outrage, statements about red lines. But outrage is not a strategy. And this is the obstacle that could derail everything. Fragmentation within Europe itself. Different countries perceive different risks. Some see opportunity. Others see threat. That division is a pressure crack, and Washington knows it. Imagine a worker in Europe watching energy prices climb, hearing that distant Arctic investments are driving global supply chains. It feels abstract, until your heating bill rises, until manufacturing costs jump, until jobs are quietly relocated to follow new routes and new resources. This is no longer theoretical. It is already reaching your wallet, and the world is watching how Europe responds. Let me bring this down from the Arctic airspace into a kitchen you recognize. A worker comes home after a long shift. The news is on in the background, talking about Greenland, about Trump, about diplomatic tension that feels distant and abstract. But on the table is an electricity bill that is higher than last winter. The groceries cost more. The employer has frozen wages, citing uncertainty in global markets. This is where geopolitics stops being a headline and starts being personal. Because the Greenland move is not an isolated maneuver. It feeds directly into energy pricing, supply chain confidence, and currency stability. When control over strategic routes and resources becomes uncertain, markets price in risk immediately. And risk is paid for by ordinary people long before it is absorbed by institutions. Here is the brutal mechanism. Investors hate ambiguity. When Europe appears divided and reactive, capital flows elsewhere. Insurance premiums on shipping routes rise. Energy contracts are renegotiated. Manufacturers hedge by relocating or automating. None of this requires a crisis declaration. It happens quietly, contract by contract, decision by decision. So who gains? Short-term traders thrive on volatility. Companies positioned close to American capital gain preferential access. States that move fast secure supply guarantees. And who loses? Workers whose jobs depend on stable logistics. Families whose savings are eroded by inflation. Small businesses that cannot hedge against global shocks. Now zoom back out. Geopolitically, this is a signal to the world. If the Arctic can be reframed as a competitive marketplace rather than a shared responsibility, then the same logic applies to other zones once considered untouchable. The South China Sea, critical African mineral corridors, even digital infrastructure in Europe itself. This is why Beijing is watching closely. This is why Moscow is recalibrating. This is why middle powers are quietly revising their doctrines. The Greenland episode is being read not as an anomaly, but as a precedent. And here is the moral tension at the heart of this story. Democracies are slow by design. They value process, debate legitimacy. Markets are fast. They reward decisiveness, even when it undermines collective interest. When leaders choose to compete on market speed rather than institutional strength, something fundamental is sacrificed. So ask yourself this. Do you want a world where strategic decisions that shape your cost of living are made through closed negotiations and financial leverage? Or one where citizens are informed, consulted, and protected, even if it takes longer? This is not a question for politicians alone. It is a demand citizens must make. Because governance is not about reacting to shocks. It is about preventing them. And right now, prevention is losing to improvisation. Now we reach the point where the story stops being about Trump as a personality and starts being about Trump as a symptom. Because the real shock is not the move itself, but how easily the system absorbed it. There was outrage, yes, statements, summits, urgent phone calls. But structurally, nothing broke. And that should worry you. Why? Because systems that can absorb disruption without reform tend to normalize it. The United States tested a boundary, not with tanks or treaties torn up on camera, but with leverage, economic leverage, strategic ambiguity. And the response revealed a deeper weakness inside Europe, a lack of unified strategic reflex. Different capitals reacted differently because their dependencies are different. Energy exposure, defense reliance, trade ties. That fragmentation is not accidental. It is a result of decades of integration without consolidation of power. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Europe has built one of the most sophisticated regulatory machines in the world, but it has neglected the question of enforcement in a world where rules are optional for those who can afford to bend them. This creates a perverse incentive. Actors willing to move fast and accept backlash gain ground. Actors committed to process lose time. And time, in geopolitics, is not neutral. It is a currency. The major obstacle now is not American pressure. It is European indecision. Can Europe agree on what Greenland represents? A moral responsibility? A strategic asset? A financial opportunity? Until that question is answered clearly, every external actor will continue to exploit the ambiguity. Picture again the ordinary citizen. He hears leaders speak of sovereignty and values, but he experiences policy through prices, taxes, and job security. When those begin to wobble, trust erodes. And when trust erodes, democratic legitimacy weakens. That is the real long-term cost. Globally, this moment is accelerating a shift away from multilateralism toward transactional politics. Alliances become conditional. Commitments become renegotiable. And smaller regions like Greenland become bargaining chips rather than stakeholders. So here is the piercing question. If governance cannot protect the most strategically vulnerable territories from becoming financial instruments, how can it protect you? The answer will define the next decade. Either institutions adapt, reclaim strategic foresight, and act with unity, or markets will continue to dictate outcomes, indifferent to borders, voters, or values. This is not about nostalgia for an old order. It is about demanding a functional one, because citizens do not owe loyalty to systems that no longer serve them. Systems owe accountability to the people they were built to protect. There is a temptation, especially in moments like this, to believe that escalation is inevitable, that once the boundary has been tested, the only possible outcome is confrontation. But that assumption itself is part of the trap, because it narrows the field of imagination and excuses inaction disguised as realism. What is actually unfolding is a race between adaptation and erosion. Europe still has options, powerful ones, but they require something far more difficult than outrage or unity statements. They require structural courage, the ability to redefine what strategic governance looks like in an age where territory, data, energy, and finance are inseparable. The obstacle standing in the way is internal. Electoral cycles reward short-term calm, not long-term resilience. Politicians hesitate to explain complexity to citizens, fearing backlash. And so decisions are postponed, diluted, or outsourced to markets that have no democratic obligation. Meanwhile, the everyday impact continues to compound. A family delays buying a home because interest rates fluctuate. A factory hesitates to invest because energy supply feels unstable. A young worker looks abroad, sensing that opportunity is migrating toward faster, more decisive systems. This is how geopolitical drift hollows out societies from the inside. On the global chessboard, the Greenland episode has already altered behavior. Emerging powers are accelerating their own strategic acquisitions, not necessarily of land, but of influence. Ports, cables, satellites, payment systems. Control without conquest is becoming the dominant model. And here is the philosophical fault line. Democracy is supposed to translate collective will into policy. Markets translate capital into outcomes. When those two systems fall out of alignment, citizens are left voiceless, watching decisions that shape their future being made elsewhere. So ask yourself this question. Who is actually governing? Elected representatives accountable to voters? Or financial and strategic actors accountable only to returns and advantage? The answer is not binary, but the balance is shifting. And every moment of hesitation accelerates that shift. The moral conclusion here is not resignation. It is demand. Demand for transparency. Demand for strategic literacy. Demand that leaders stop treating citizens as spectators and start treating them as stakeholders. Because in the end, Greenland is not the issue. It is the mirror, a reflection of how fragile stability becomes when governance forgets its purpose, and a reminder that citizens deserve more than reassurance. They deserve agency, foresight, and protection in a world that no longer waits. At this stage, the danger is subtle but profound. Not panic, not collapse, but normalization. When extraordinary moves become familiar, they stop provoking resistance. They become part of the background noise of global affairs. And that is when power quietly consolidates. The Greenland shock is already fading from headlines, replaced by the next crisis, the next controversy. But the mechanisms it revealed remain active. Investment channels continue to shift. Strategic assessments are being rewritten. Quiet negotiations are ongoing, far from public scrutiny. This is how structural change actually happens, not in moments of drama, but in periods of attention fatigue. For citizens, this creates a psychological disconnect. You are told that nothing has fundamentally changed, yet you feel the pressure everywhere, in your savings, in your job prospects, in the sense that the future is becoming less predictable, not more. That tension breeds cynicism, and cynicism is corrosive to democratic life. Globally, the message has been received. Power belongs to those who act first, justify later, and absorb the cost. Institutional legitimacy, once the ultimate shield, is now treated as one factor among many, useful when it aligns with interest, expendable when it does not. This does not mean rules no longer matter. It means they are being stress tested. And in that test, hesitation is interpreted as weakness. Here is a question that should provoke you to respond, not just observe. If leaders can reinterpret strategic norms without meaningful public debate, what role is left for the citizen beyond reaction? Because democracy cannot survive as a spectator sport. It requires informed pressure. It requires discomfort. It requires the willingness to demand explanations that go beyond slogans. The final tension is moral. Stability is not free. It requires investment, foresight, and sometimes restraint. Volatility promises speed and profit, but externalizes risk onto those least equipped to absorb it: workers, families, future generations. So the choice is not between America and Europe or Trump and his critics. The real choice is between governance that serves the many over time and systems that reward the few in the moment. And that choice is being made right now, quietly, while attention drifts elsewhere. So let me leave you not with conclusion, but with a reckoning, because this story does not end with Greenland, and it does not end with Trump. It ends with you, and with what you are willing to accept as normal. Power, when left unexamined, always drifts toward convenience, toward speed, toward decisions made by the few, justified after the fact to the many. The Greenland episode stripped away the comforting illusion that stability is automatic, that treaties enforce themselves, that institutions will always catch up in time. They will not, unless they are pushed. What citizens deserve is not theatrics or reassurance. They deserve clarity. They deserve leaders who explain why strategic choices are being made, who admit trade-offs, who treat the public as capable of understanding complexity rather than as a risk to be managed. Ask yourself this final question. If governance cannot protect long-term stability from short-term opportunism, what is it actually for? Because democracy is not just the right to vote every few years. It is the right to be informed before the future is quietly reshaped. It is the right to demand that economic power serves social resilience, not the other way around. Greenland became the stage because it was assumed to be safe from ambition. That assumption collapsed. Others will follow if nothing changes. And history is unforgiving to societies that confuse calm with control. The moral obligation now is vigilance, not outrage that fades, but attention that endures, not blind trust, but informed insistence. Because in a world where markets move faster than institutions, the only counterweight left is a citizenry that refuses to look away. That is what you are owed, and that is what you must claim.